What up, though? Today we got millions of people, men, women, and children being brought here seeking asylum, looking for work slash labor slash employment slash slavery and indenture. Not just here. If what is said is true, that the taxes being gangstered from my check is paying for food, clothing, and shelter for those aforementioned men, women, and children, look, stop giving my scratch and booking me. Ask me first. Beyond that, you can bring who you want to bring. Everybody always wanted to come here. We been here. And we been shaking. Oxford English Dictionary. Slave trade. The action or practice of buying and selling people as slaves. An instance of this, the procurement by capture or purchase and transportation of enslaved people from Africa for sale in the Americas. In later use, also with reference to exploitative and coercive practices such as people trafficking, debt bondage, etc. It's from 1691. Again, the action or practice of buying and selling people as slaves. An instance of this, the procurement by capture or purchase and transportation of enslaved people from Africa for sale in the Americas. In later use, also with reference to exploitative and coercive practices such as people trafficking, debt bondage, etc. The Atlantic slave trade was largely carried out using a triangular maritime trading route in which manufactured goods from Europe were carried by ship to Africa and used to buy enslaved people who were then transported to the Americas across the Atlantic. From 1691, the company have no forts, castles, nor factories from Accra to Angola, nor do they suppose them necessary to carry on the slave trade. Let's go over this one more time from 1691. The company have no forts, castles, nor factories from Accra to Angola, nor do they suppose them necessary to carry on the slave trade. From 1994, cross-border and transoceanic trade in migrants from developing countries to the West is becoming a business so odious it amounts to a modern-day slave trade. Cross-border and transoceanic trade in migrants. Smithsonian Magazine. America's First True Pilgrims. Kenneth C. Davis. The first pilgrims to reach America seeking religious freedom were English and settled in Massachusetts. Some 50 years before the Mayflower left port, a band of French colonists came to the New World. Like the later English pilgrims, these Protestants were victims of religious wars raging across France and much of Europe. And like those later pilgrims, they too wanted religious freedom and the chance for a new life. But they also wanted to attack Spanish treasure ships sailing back from the Americas. St. Augustine, Florida, September 1565. Admiral Pedro Menendez pressed his army of 500 infantrymen up Florida's Atlantic coast with a crusader's fervor. These 16th century Spanish shock troops slogged through the tropical downpour in their heavy armor, carrying pikes, broadswords, and the harquebus, a primitive front-loading musket which had been used with devastating effect by the conquistador armies of Cortés and Pizarro in Mexico and Peru. Each man also carried a 12-pound sack of bread and a bottle of wine. Guided by friendly Timucuan tribesmen, the Spanish assault force had spent 2 difficult days negotiating the treacherous 38-mile trek from St. Augustine, their recently established settlement further down the coast, slowed by knee-deep muck that sucked at their boots. They had been forced to cross rain-swollen rivers, home to the man-eating monsters and flying fish of legend. Wet, tired, and miserable, they were far from home in a land that had completely swallowed 2 previous Spanish armies, conquistadors who themselves had been conquered by tropical diseases, starvation, and hostile native warriors. Admiral Menendez's objective was the French settlement of Fort Caroline, France's first foothold in the Americas, located near present-day Jacksonville, on what the French called the River of May. On this pitch-black night, the small, triangular, wood palisaded fort was occupied by a few hundred men, women, and children. They were France's first colonists in the New World and the true first pilgrims in America. The handful of Fort Caroline's defenders who were not lucky enough to escape were quickly rounded up by the Spanish. About 50 women and children were also taken captive, later to be shipped to Puerto Rico. The men were hung without hesitation. Victims of the political and religious wars raging across Europe, the ill-fated inhabitants of Fort Caroline were not Lutherans at all. For the most part, they were Huguenots, French Protestants who followed the teachings of John Calvin, the French-born Protestant theologian. Unaware that Fort Caroline had fallen, groups of French survivors of the storm's savage fleet came ashore near present-day Daytona Beach and Cape Canaveral. Trudging north, they were spotted by Indians who alerted Menendez. The bedraggled Frenchmen were met and captured by Spanish troops at a coastal inlet about 17 miles south of St. Augustine on September 29, 1565. Expecting to be imprisoned or perhaps ransomed, the exhausted and hungry Frenchmen surrendered without a fight. They were ferried across the inlet to a group of dunes where they were fed what proved to be a last meal. At the Admiral's orders, between 111 and 200 of the French captives, documents differ on the exact number, were put to death. In his own report to King Philip, Admiral Menendez wrote matter-of-factly, if not proudly, "I caused their hands to be tied behind them and put them to the knife. 16 of the company were allowed to live. self-professed Catholics who were spared at the behest of the priest who reported, "All the rest died for being Lutherans and against our holy Catholic faith." Spaniards fighting Frenchmen in Florida 4 decades before England established its first permanent settlement in America and half a century before the Pilgrims sailed. Excerpted from America's Hidden History, Untold Tales of the First Pilgrims, Fighting Women and Forgotten Founders Who Shaped a Nation by Kenneth C. Davis, 2008. Britannica Online Encyclopedia. American Colonies. The 13 British colonies that were established during the 17th and 18th and early 18th centuries in what is now a part of the eastern United States. Their settlements had spread far beyond the Appalachians and extended from Maine in the north to the Altamaha River in Georgia when the Revolution began, and there were at that time about 2.5 million colonists. The colonists encouraged early marriages and large families. Bachelors and unwed women could not live very comfortably and were relatively few. Despite heavy losses as a result of disease and hardship, the colonists multiplied. Their numbers were also greatly increased by continuing immigration from Great Britain and from Europe west of the Elbe River. In Britain and continental Europe, the colonies were looked upon as a land of promise. Moreover, both the homeland and the colonies encouraged immigration, offering inducements to those who would venture beyond the ocean. The colonies particularly welcomed foreign Protestants. In addition, many people were sent to America against their will: convicts, political prisoners, and enslaved Africans. This is from Europe. They're being sent from Europe. German and Scotch-Irish immigrants arrived in large numbers during the 18th century. The History of White People in America, Episode 1, How America Invented Race. This is from WGBH.org by Megan Smith. The History of White People in America takes the audience on a journey through American history, starting in the 17th century, the 1600s, and in particular looks at how the crafting of the idea of the white race, of whiteness, helped shape the nation's history, designating other groups for subjugation and having wide-ranging ramifications on social class and life experience that exist to this day. The white race was invented by Virginians in 1676 in the aftermath of a populist rebellion of impoverished, indentured, and enslaved Africans and Europeans, now known as Bacon's Rebellion. The white race was invented by rich Virginians in 1676. Each episode in the series illuminates a crucial moment in the American story where American and white were conflated. Race as we know it in America was invented by wealthy colonialists. Race as we know it in America was invented by wealthy colonialists of European background. as a means of social and economic control. They divided poor people by skin color. The wealthy benefited from this division then and now. Irish, Italians, Germans, Jews, Catholics. Until recently in our history, none of these groups were considered white by law, custom, or culture. Let's go back. This has to sink in. The white race was invented by rich Virginians in 1676. A crucial moment in the American story where American and white were conflated. Race as we know it in America was invented by wealthy colonialists of European background as a means of social and economic control. They divided poor people by skin color. The wealthy benefited from this division then and now. Irish, Italians, Germans, Jews, Catholics. Until recently in our history, none of these groups were considered white by law, custom, or culture. So watch your mouth. Since before the revolution, and watch your words, watch your descriptions. Since before the revolution, American has equaled white. Since before the revolution, American has equaled white. Enslaved African people understood this. Indigenous people knew this. And wealthy white landowners made sure that each new wave of immigrants knew it too. Early ideas, which were codified into laws, led to generational acceptance of a false hierarchy, an illusion of superiority and inferiority that persists to this day, to this second. Encyclopedia.com. The Coming of the First White Man. Told by George R. Betts and translated by Nora Dowenhauer. 1987, reprinted in American Literature, Apprentice Hall Anthology. According to some scholars, native peoples arrived in North America from Asia via the Bering Sea. According to some scholars, native peoples, your Native Americans, just trying to let the picture pop up in your head, the electricity produce a picture. According to some scholars, Native Americans, the people you know as Native Americans today, arrived in North America from Asia via the Bering Strait land bridge in about AD 986. In about 986, the Thule Inuit in Greenland were the first Native Americans to come in contact with Europeans. Inuit hunters encountered Norse inhabitants of present-day Scandinavia, also called Vikings, expedition led by Eric the Red. Inuit hunters encountered the Vikings expedition led by Eric the Red, who founded a settlement in Greenland. In 1002, Eric's son, Leif Erikson, made one of the first documented European contacts with Native Americans. According to the saga of Eric the Red, contained in a collection of Norse sagas titled Hauksbok, spent the winter of 1002 in a place called Vinland. Historians disagree about the exact location of Vinland, though many speculate it could have been Nova Scotia. Where is Vinland? What is the history of Vinland? Homework. A peninsula on the coast of eastern Canada or northern New England, the northeast part of modern day United States. Yet the Native Americans maintain their own way of life. So it says the first Native Americans, they say, came from Asia across the Bering Strait. This is what this is saying, and they maintain their way of life, which means their way of dress, which means their way of habitation. The situation changed dramatically, however, when a Spanish expedition led by Christopher Columbus, reports to Ferdinand and Isabella, landed on an island in the Bahamas in the Caribbean Sea, south of Florida in 1492. From that time onward, Europeans came to establish settlements in North America. According to some scholars, in the 1490s, the native population of North America north of the Rio Grande, a river that runs along the border between present-day Texas and Mexico, was estimated as 7 million to 10 million. These native peoples made up approximately 600 tribes and spoke numerous languages, perhaps more than 1,000 different dialects. Although native groups had distinct social and cultural characteristics, they were all focused on the family, clan, and village. Life was tied to the cycles of nature, and their religions revolved around the belief that nature was alive, pulsating with spiritual power. In the area that is now the United States, Native Americans encountered European explorers and colonists in 3 distinct regions: the Southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas; the Southeast, Florida, Louisiana, Georgia, and the Carolinas, Maryland, and Virginia; and the Northeast, New York, and Pennsylvania. The earliest Europeans in these regions were the Spanish, French, English, Dutch, and Germans, who arrived in increasing numbers over the next 250 years. At the same time, the French were settling in eastern Canada around present-day Quebec, and Montreal. By the late 1700s, Europeans, including settlers from Russia, were moving into southeastern Alaska. Dates are important. By the late 1700s. Remember, we started off talking slave trade here. Now we're in the 1700s. We're in the late 1700s. Europeans, including settlers from Russia, were moving into southeastern Alaska. Remember the time around the so-called transatlantic slave trade, where millions upon hundreds of millions of so-called Africans were taken. I've heard terms used such as kidnapped and brought here directly from West Africa across the Atlantic. Let's shake it. Encyclopedia.com. European migrations to American colonies, 1492 to 1820. In the 3 centuries following the voyages, 1451 to 1506, to the Americas, the world was transformed by a massive transoceanic movement of peoples, the largest in human history up to that time. The migration of several million Europeans to the Americas during this period was fundamental to the formation of New World society. from 1451 to 1506 to the Americas. From Europe, the world was transformed by a massive transoceanic movement of peoples, the largest in human history up to that time. The migration of several million Europeans to the Americas during this period was fundamental to the formation of New World society. If several million came from Europe, do you think they were all the king and queen's men? No. They were coming to work, labor, slave, be employees. Ultimately, having to work off their fare that they were charged to come here. You take the bus, you take the L, you take the train, you take a flight. They took a boat. You pay up front. They paid on the back end. Between 1492 and 1820, approximately 2.6 million Europeans immigrated to the Americas. Between 1492 and 1820, does that not cover the entire transatlantic slave trade as you know it? From 1492 to 1820? Approximately 2.6 million Europeans immigrated to the Americas. It's plenty of labor. That's a mighty big labor force, if you ask me. And no, they weren't the king and queen's men. They was looking for a job. Oxford English Dictionary, indenture. This is from 1672. The action of indenting or notching a thing on the edge, an angular notch, indentation, or incision in the edge or border of anything. This is from 1423. A deed between two or more parties with mutual covenants, mutual agreements, executed in two or more copies, all having their tops or edges correspondingly indented or serrated for identification and security. Hence, a deed or sealed agreement or contract between two or more parties without special reference to its form. Originally, both copies were written on one piece of parchment or paper and then cut asunder in a serrated or sinuous line, so that when brought together again at any time, the two edges exactly tallied and showed that they were parts of one and the same original document. Hence the expression pair of indentures. Occasionally, a word, sentence, or figure was engrossed on the space where they were divided, as in the space between a bank check and its counterfoil. From 1463, the contract between which an apprentice is bound to the master. Also, the contract by which a person binds himself or herself to service in the colonies, etc. The contract by which an apprentice is bound to the master. Master. The one who the apprentice learns from. To take up one's indentures, to receive the indenture back from the master in evidence of the completion of apprenticeship or service. Y'all let words disturb y'all. But words have meanings. It's okay. It's okay. Some are emotionally tied to certain words or emotionally tied to the emotions that were given you when certain words were presented to you. This is from 1822. The indenture of the boy expires when he is 21 years of age. This is from 1862. By the terms of the indenture, the coolie agrees to serve the planter for 3 years. Agrees to serve the planter for 3 years. Agrees. Receiving the same rate of wages as is paid to the unindentured laborer. 1420, an official or formal list, inventory certificate, etc., prepared originally in duplicate for purposes of control as a voucher, etc., and properly authenticated. 1875, the persons arrested are to be delivered to the ordinaries by indenture, to be made within 10 days of the arrest. 1540, contract, mutual engagement. Contract, mutual engagement from 1540. 1631, indenture, verb transitive, to bind by indentures, especially as an apprentice or servant. 1878, indentureship, the position of being indentured as an apprentice, servant, etc. UShistory.org, the Southern Colonies, indentured servants. The growth of tobacco, rice, and indigo and the plantation economy created a tremendous need for labor in Southern English America. Without the aid of modern machinery, human sweat and blood was necessary for the planting, cultivation, and harvesting of these cash crops. While slaves existed in the English colonies throughout the 1600s, indentured servitude was the method of choice employed by many planters before the 1680s. Virginia and Maryland operated under what was known as the headright system. The leaders of each colony knew that labor was essential for economic survival, that jobs were essential for economic survival. Jobs are essential for any company to survive. So they provided incentives for planters to import workers. They provided incentives for planters to import workers. For each laborer brought across the Atlantic, the master was rewarded with 50 acres of land. They received the services of the workers for the duration of the indenture. These people were only concerned with commerce. And when I say these people, I'm not attaching a complexion to it. I'm not attaching a complexion to it. Because ultimately, it depends on relationships. Some people had relationships with others that they all had the same intentions: commerce, control, and hundreds of years of the same. They received the services of the workers for the duration of the indenture. Each indentured servant would have their fare across the Atlantic paid in full by their master. A contract was written that stipulated the length of service, typically 5 years. The servant would be supplied room and board while working in the master's fields. Upon completion of the contract, the servant would receive freedom dues, a prearranged termination bonus. This might include land, money, a gun, clothes, or food. It seemed like a terrific way for the luckless English poor to make their way to prosperity in a new land. Come on, get it together. Get it together. Only about 40% of indentured servants lived to complete the terms of their contracts. A woman who became pregnant while a servant often had years tacked on to the end of her service time. Early in the century, some servants were able to gain their own land as free men. The former servants were pushed westward, where the mountainous land was less arable and the threat from Indians constant. We're talking about that time. We're talking about that time where some of your early leaders, who you term black, Negroes, they told you that hundreds of millions of people were taken from West Africa and brought directly across the Atlantic. And that's who your ancestors are. You are a product of that journey, of that transatlantic slave trade. We're in those years right now. We're looking through those years, and what do we see? What do you see? What do you hear? Let's shake it. Cambridge University Press. Cambridge Core, The Rise and Fall of Indentured Servitude in the Americas, an Economic Analysis. Cambridge University Press, David W. Gallinson. Indentured servitude appeared in Virginia in 1620. The 1619 project, 1620. This is the time when when all of our ancestors, all of us brown people who are termed black, Negro colored, African American, American Indian, American, this is when our story begins, right? Right? Wait a minute. And I've spoke about this at length. Now it's just tired. Indentured servitude appeared in Virginia by 1620. Initially, a device used to transport European workers to the New World. Over time, servitude dwindled as black slavery grew in importance in the British colonies. Indentured servitude reappeared in the Americas in the mid-19th century as a means of transporting Asians to the Caribbean sugar islands and South America. Servitude then remained in legal use until its abolition in 1917. They just gonna go right past that. We go right past that real quick. Over time, servitude dwindled as black slavery grew in importance in the British colonies. So European servitude or slavery dwindled as black employment grew, as more so-called blacks took the jobs. And then, as a means of indentured servitude reappeared in the Americas in the mid 19th century, 1800s, as a means of transporting Asians to the Caribbean sugar islands and South America. Servitude was revived for migration to the West Indies during the time of the Great Free Migration of Europeans to the Americas. Not hearing much about no hundreds of millions of Africans. Not hearing it, not seeing it. The system was clearly used in 1619. Kingsbury, Susan Kingsbury, Myra, ed. The Records of the Virginia Company of London, Washington, D.C., 1933, Volume 3, page 226, 227. It is not clear whether it was in use earlier. The system was clearly used in 1619 project. Y'all hear that? (1619) has become a machine. A regulation of Virginia in 1616 mentions a covenanted obligation of every farmer to pay yearly into the company's magazine for himself and every manservant 2 barrels and a half a piece of their best Indian wheat, which is corn. Historical Manuscript Commission, 8th Report, Volume 2, number 208, page 31. The payment made by the farmer for himself was apparently a rental payment for an allotment of land for the company. Charles M., The Colonial Period of American History, New Haven, 1934, Volume 1, page 124, but it is not specified whether the payment to be made for each servant was a rental fee for a possible additional allotment of land or a rental payment to the company for the services of the servant himself. Servants come, immigrants come, and the people get more land. They are rewarded with more land. Smith, Colonists in Bondage, page 12. The contract that came to be used in these bargains was of a type commonly used in England for a variety of legal transactions, known as an indenture. During 1619, that's 1619 again. If you had any questions, during 1619 through 1622, the Virginia Company sent several shipments of vagrant children to Virginia. Child trafficking. During 1619, 1622, the Virginia Company sent several shipments of vagrant children to Virginia. Their passage had been paid by the City of London, and in return, the company agreed to place them with planters as apprentices. They're going to place children with strangers. They're going to place children with strangers. They're going to ship them across the water to a land that they've never been to before, to things that they're not familiar with, and they're going to put them with adults that they have no idea, they don't know. You know how when you send your children to strangers every day to be educated, let's shake it. C. Johnston, Robert C. Johnson, The Transportation of Vagrant Children from London to Virginia, 1618 to 1622. Disgusting. In Rhinemuth, Howard S. Jr., Early Stewart Studies, Minneapolis, 1970, page 137 through 51. Indentured servant was primarily used in order to facilitate migration. Once the legal basis of the institution had been laid down, it could also be used to improve the functioning of markets for credit for other purposes. Thus, for example, in 1640, a Barbados planter named Richard Atkinson borrowed the sum of 2,000 pounds of cotton from John Batt. The agreement provided that if the said 2,000 pounds of cotton shall not be paid upon the day aforesaid, that then and immediately upon default of the said payment, it shall be for the said John Batt or his assigns to take the body of me, Richard Atkinson, servant, for the term of 6 years, without any further trouble or suit of law. Quoted in Harlow, Vincent T., A History of Barbados, 1625 to 1685, Oxford, 1926, page 294. Thus, Old Mixon, John noted in 1708 that slaves that are much born in Barbados are much more useful men than those that are brought from Guinea or Africa. From Guinea or Africa. Thus, Old Mixon, John noted in 1708 that slaves that are born in Barbados are much more useful men than those that are brought from Guinea. The British Empire in America, London, 1708, volume 2, page 121 through 22. It might be noted that recent research has raised the possibility that the volume of immigration to the United States in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, 1700s and 1800s, was substantially greater than has generally been believed. This is from Henry A. Jimmery, European Immigration to the New World, 1700 through 1820, Numbers and Quasi-Numbers, unpublished paper, Colby College, 1983. In addition to these movements, during the 19th century, relatively small migrations of indentured workers occurred from Africa and Madeira to the West Indies and South America. Okay. Sheesh. Let's read that again. In addition to these movements, during the 19th century, 1800s, relatively small migrations of indentured workers occurred from Africa and Madeira to West Indies and South America. For an overview of these bound migrations, see Ingerman Stanley L., Contract Labor, Sugar, and Technology in the 19th Century. This journal, 43. Also, Roberts, G.W., and Byrne, J., Summary Statistics on Indenture and Associated Migrations Affecting the West Indies, 1834 through 1918 Population Studies. 125 through 134, see Tinker A., New System of Slavery, Chapter 6. It might be noted that the Asian migrants to the West Indies often appear to have chosen not to return to their native countries after becoming free. The magnitude of these population movements were very different. Thus, it has been estimated that 45.2 million free Europeans migrated to the Americas during 1846 to 1920. Thus, it has been estimated that 45.2 million free Europeans migrated to the Americas during 1846 through 1920, compared to a total of 775,000 bound Indians and Chinese who migrated to the West Indies and South America in the 19th century, and another 100,000 bound Chinese and Japanese who migrated to Hawaii Hawaii. Stanley L. Ingerman, Servants to Slaves to Servants, Contract Labor and European Expansion in Vanden Bogaert, H. and Emmer, PC, eds, Colonialism and Migration, Indentured Labor Before and After Slavery, The Hague, forthcoming. Although indentured servitude was a form of credit, it involved more than many credit transactions. For an indentured migrant not only agreed to repay his loan, but to give up much of his freedom during the period of repayment. Thus, servants typically gave up the freedom to marry during their terms, to engage in business on their own account, to determine where they would live, and so on. Skip it. Let's just clear it up. Let's just clear it up right now. Let's clear it up right now. This stuff is no longer needs to be discussed at a certain point. Nothing's hidden. Ain't nobody hide nothing. Ain't no problems. PBS. Indentured servants. They chose to use that picture for indentured servants. Remove the label indentured servants, and we blow this picture up. First thing gonna come to your mind is slaves. Oh my God, I feel so bad for our people. I can see the terror in their face. Somehow think very lowly of your people. Indentured servants. Without indentured servants, the nation today known for freedom would not have been built. In the colonial era, over half the European immigrants to America were indentured servants. Most were impoverished young European men eager to make a new life in the new world. So they traded passage across the Atlantic for several years of hard labor. Interesting how they put the picture that they put. And we kick it off talking about European immigrants. Could they be talking about those people? Could those people be black Europeans? Most were impoverished young European men eager to make a new life in the new world. So they traded passage across the Atlantic for several years of hard labor. They had fewer rights than freed men, and wealthy landowners often treated them as second-class citizens. Unlike slaves, of course, servants signed a contract and were willingly bound to their masters. By the early 19th century, cheaper transatlantic fares and the idea that only Africans should be servile led to the end of indentured servitude in America. By the early 19th century, by the early 1800s, it said cheaper transatlantic fares and the idea that only Africans should be servile led to the end of indentured servitude in America. And we know, if we're speaking of the early 19th century, we're speaking of the early 1800s, which in, I believe, 1807, it was no longer legal to bring in servants from Africa. So this is a word salad. Not necessarily using a bunch of words that don't mean anything, but the switching around of events. Calling something something else in a different place. But the things that always brings us back to reality is the dates, are the dates. The dates bring us back to reality. It helps us get past the illusion. Because make no mistake about it, a picture is there. A picture is being attempted to be painted. You are being fed something. You have to be more meticulous with what you consume. The History of Virginia by Robert Beverly, a native and inhabitant of the place. 1855, The History of Virginia. Book 3, Of the Indians, Their Religion, Laws, and Customs in War and Peace, Chapter 1. The Indians are of the middling and largest stature of the English. They are straight and well proportioned, having the cleanest and most exact limbs in the world. They are so perfect in their outward frame that I have never heard of one single Indian that was either dwarfish, crooked, bandy-legged, or otherwise misshapen. Their color, when they are grown up, is a chestnut brown and tawny. Their skin comes afterwards to harden and grow blacker by greasing and sunning themselves. They have generally coal black hair and very black eyes. The women wear the hair of the head very long, either hanging at their backs or brought before in a single lock, bound up with the fillet of pique or beads. Sometimes also they wear it neatly tied up in a knot behind. It is commonly greased and shining black. Do the right thing.